So the three major changes that I'm seeing after reading the all county letter that came out last month. The first one is that parents no longer have to have left full-time employment in order to be paid as a parent provider. That means that you can be a parent provider even if you are working full-time. Parent can work full-time and provide their child's hours, with the exception that you cannot be providing hours for your child while you're working. So, like you may still have to hire an outside provider to do hours while you're at work. If your child needs a certain number of diaper changes per day, you're not doing all of those during the time that you're home after work. So you have to think about what's realistic in terms of the services that are authorized for your child and when they're taking place. Um, if you are working full time, you may not be able to do all of the hours. There's only so many hours in a week. But people had asked in the past, like, can I have somebody come and take care of my child during the day, and then I could be the provider at night when I'm home and doing and being the one that's taking care of them, especially if they're children who wake up in the middle of the night and need a lot of care. And now the answer is yes. Before, the answer was no. This also means that if you are in school full time, you can also be providing the hours. In the past, there were restrictions on, like, if you were going to school full time, even if you were only in school for in class for 12 hours a week or whatever is full time enrollment, the presumption was that you are too busy to, it's the equivalent of a full time job between studying and doing your schoolwork. And so now you're not limited to attending classes part-time. You're limited by what your child's schedule requires, but there are not further restrictions from IHSS about what you can and can't do, aside from, again, like being authorized to work in the first place and having, like, there are certain criminal backgrounds that you cannot be a provider if you have those. So those have not been changed either. But what was happening was that children would be awarded IHSS hours, but their parents, for whatever reason, whether it was immigration status or criminal background, could not provide the hour, could not be paid as providers. But because they were considered available, you couldn't hire an outside provider either. And so these children needed these services and were not able to get these IHSS services that they were authorized for. And that's a big part of the reason why they changed this. The second is that there no longer seems to be a requirement that another parent be unavailable. So you can choose a parent provider regardless of the availability of either parent. And the third change is that your child can hire an outside provider. There are no limitations on when you can hire an outside provider. So previously, if the parent was the provider, you could only hire an outside provider if the parent was working. And if the parent was not the provider and was working full time, then again, there were restrictions on when you could have an outside provider come in. So now those restrictions are lifted. So essentially, children have the same ability to hire a provider as adults have. The provider or the parent still has to be authorized to work in the United States. So that has not changed. The other thing that has not changed is parent responsibility. So if I've talked in the past about the functional skills index and how they gauge kind of what kind of care a parent is expected to provide to a typically developing child of the same age compared to what a child receiving IHSS needs. And even though it may be a third-party provider, they will still presume that the needs that are typical to a child of that age are still being met by the legally responsible guardian, whether that's the parent or grandparent, whoever is legally responsible for the child's. That's still parent responsibility, even if a third party is providing the IHSS hours. So that has not changed. Parent responsibility is still parent responsibility, but the IHSS authorized hours can be worked by anyone who's authorized to provide IHSS hours and has gone through the orientation. This will also mean that parents parents should not have to provide their work schedule, should not have to provide their school schedule, should not have to let them know when the other parent is home and when the parent is not, because that does not happen for adult recipients. So this is basically creating creating more equity between children and adults in terms of children's ability to access the IHSS hours that they have been awarded, because what was happening is that there were barriers to children getting the services that they needed because of these requirements. So now it will be easier for minor recipients to get the care that they need because they have more freedom to choose the provider. If the worker continues to ask for your work schedule and for certification that you're working part-time or full-time, I would give them a copy of the all county letter. Um, we'll make sure that we link it and show them a copy of this letter, because this is something that everybody should be receiving training on, because this is a very big change from the way things have been done before. So they should be receiving training on it. Whether that happens, I don't know. But it's worthwhile to keep a copy of this all county letter, so that if they start asking about your work schedule and saying, well, you can't be the provider if you're working full time, you can pull this out and be like, look, CDSS just issued guidance on this. Um, and just remember that these changes don't take effect until 60 days after the date on the all county letter. I believe it's like the fourth week in February that it goes into effect. All of the restrictions for minors that were different from adults have been dropped. So all of the work requirements and the availability of the other parent requirements and the outside provider requirements, those have been dropped. So anything that was required in order to be authorized as an IHSS provider for any recipient, those are still in place, like the work requirements, the authorization to work. But anything that was different between being a minor recipient and being an adult recipient is now the same. So another thing that this may impact is parents who have multiple children who are receiving IHSS. Because in the past, you had to have one parent that was unavailable and the other parent would do the hours, but then you would still have hours left over. And in some cases, the other parent could step in and take the hours once you maxed out the hours. But in some cases, you couldn't because they were working full time. And so now you may be able to utilize more of those hours without hiring an outside provider, if the other parent is able to provide some of the care when they get home from work. You still have to do the 24-hour plan. So you still have to be able to demonstrate that even if you're working full time, that you have something in place so that your child has their protective supervision. Now, where I could see this becoming an issue where it has not been in the past, what it has been in the past, but there was a counter to it, is that the regional center will sometimes say, oh, well, you have IHSS, you could be hiring somebody else to provide some of that respite. And in the past, the answer was, well, no, if I'm an IHSS provider, if I'm a parent provider, then there are restrictions on when I can bring a third party provider, and it can only be under certain circumstances. And a break is not one of them. But now it is potentially. And so I don't know what's going to happen in terms of whether the regional centers will start trying to get parents to use some of their IHSS hours for respite. And I think that's something that we have to keep an eye on. Because, I mean, the reality is, like, if parents have been providing these services, their child still needs all these services. IHSS does not cover 24 hours a day. And any parent who's providing max hours to their child, that they're providing more hours than that. And so I hope that the regional center will not ask parents to use IHSS hours as respite, because we need more respite than that, and we're already doing all those hours. But I don't know. I don't know.